So let's go ahead and get started with our first guest talking about Shakespeare. Her name is Katherine Chiljan. She's an independent scholar of the Shakespeare authorship question. Her interest was first piqued many years ago after watching a television debate on the topic when an English professor failed to prove his case that the man born in Stratford-upon-Avon was the great author William Shakespeare. A graduate of UCLA, a BA in history, Katherine started doing her own research and concluded that William Shakespeare was the pen name of the 17th Earl of Oxford. This theory was first proposed in 1920 by J.T. Looney, author of Shakespeare Identified. She has served as editor of an Oxfordian newsletter, has debated English professors on the Shakespeare authorship question at the Smithsonian Institute and the Mechanics Institute in San Francisco. Katherine's book, called Shakespeare Suppressed, the Uncensored Truth About Shakespeare and His Works, was written in 2011, or published in 2011. Took almost 7 years to complete and earned her an award for distinguished scholarship from Concordia University in April of 2012. She's also a contributing author to the new ebook Contested Year, which points out errors and omissions and unsupported statements in a recent Shakespeare book by English professor James Shapiro, The Year of Lear, Shakespeare in 1606. Without any further delay, let's get Katherine on the phone. Katherine, good evening. Welcome to Fringe Radio and AM 630.
So nice to be here. Thank you.
Well, thank you for taking time out of your busy weekend and joining us for some time.
My pleasure.
I came across an article, and as I mentioned before when I called you on the phone, I came across an article that said it was going to be Shakespeare had passed away on the 23rd of April, 400 years ago. And I've never done a program on William Shakespeare. Of course, I'm in my mid-50s, so I've heard of William Shakespeare and his plays. And when I went through school, I studied a little bit of Shakespeare. But I've got to be honest with you, Katherine, I don't know a whole heck of a lot about him. He is a famous name, a famous person that so many people have heard about, probably just about everybody. But there's so many interesting details. How did you get into studying Shakespeare? And let's talk about your book and your research.
Yes, thank you. Well, you're not alone not knowing a lot about Shakespeare. Often when I give talks, the first thing I'll do is I'll ask, what do you know about him, the man, Shakespeare the man? Mm-hmm. And, they'll say, oh, he was born in Stratford-on-Avon, and, oh, he was an actor. And that's about the extent of it. That's the great problem with Shakespeare, is there's absolutely no biography. And what really got me involved and interested is I was reading Hamlet, and I looked at a list of plays, of Shakespeare plays, in the presumed order. And what I didn't realize is that there's a great controversy as to when these plays were written. Mm-hmm. And I thought to myself, gee, they don't know what year exactly Hamlet was written. They don't know when Comedy of Errors was written, all these great plays. I mean, there's been hundreds of years of scholarship. And the reason why all of these plays have question marks as to when they were composed is because there's no biography to match it up against, no literary biography. Mm-hmm. And that is the problem with Shakespeare and Shakespeare research. If you look at the facts of the person that the world is celebrating today as the death of 400th anniversary of the death of the great author, he was a person born in Stratford-on-Avon, and so we refer to him as the Stratford man. But if you look at the lifetime facts of the Stratford man, what we know about him, it's very little. And, for example, we don't have any evidence of his schooling. We don't have anything in his handwriting. We don't have any play manuscripts that have survived. We don't have any lifetime image of him.
Right, just pictures, just drawings.
Yeah, but those were made after he died.
Gotcha. Okay, all right.
So everywhere you look for him, there's a zero.
No iPhones back then, Kat.
No iPhones. And probably the weirdest biggest zero of all is that when he died, this is the Stratford man, in 1616, which is 400 years ago, no one mentioned it. No one mentioned it in a letter. No one wrote a tribute to supposedly the author of Hamlet and King Lear. No one said a word about it. And, in fact, no one really celebrated his death until 7 years later. So that's kind of your first hint that there's a little bit of a disconnect between this man born in Stratford
he almost could,
and the great author.
He almost could be a fictional character.
Well, he was not a fictional character.
No, I know.
He was a real person, but the problem is that the name William Shakespeare, in fact, was someone's pen name.
Okay.
But at the same concurrently, there was a man who was born with that name. And what has happened is the two have become confused, especially since this Stratford man, he was involved in the theater, just like the man using the pen name William Shakespeare. And so, we can get into that as to how they got confused. But if you look at the lifetime evidence for the Stratford man, the known facts about him, they amount to very little. They amount to he was christened. We have that document, mention of it. We have mention of his marriage, in a record. We have his application for a coat of arms. We see him listed in lawsuits. We see him listed as a money lender. We do show him being involved with the theater as in the sense of being a shareholder of a theater, and also being associated with 2 acting companies. But nothing connects him to education or writing during his lifetime, and that is the problem. That is the big problem.
Well, again, with no real from that time period, no real records, of like we have today, where everything can be interconnected. I can see how this whole play kind of plays out. All right, everybody, welcome back to Fringe Radio. Our guest is Katherine Chiljan. Her book is called Shakespeare Suppressed: The Uncensored Truth About Shakespeare and His Works. Again, Katherine, it's an honor to have you on the program here tonight.
Thank you.
So let's pick back up again then before we had to take those commercials. We were talking about, again, documents of fact that compared to today are just pretty non-existent.
Yes, and if you compare it to other writers during this period, they're a fairly small group of people, and we have pretty good biographies of a lot of them. Like, for example, John Lilly, he was a court playwright, and he wrote several plays for Queen Elizabeth I and her court. And, in fact, we have letters between them. So we knew that they knew each other. Now, William Shakespeare, the great author, the Queen Elizabeth had seen at least 2 Shakespeare plays, probably 3. But 2, if you look at the printed editions of the plays, 2 of these plays, Love Labour's Lost and Merry Wives of Windsor, it says that it was shown before Queen Elizabeth. This is during her lifetime. And yet, we don't have any sort of documentation that Shakespeare met Queen Elizabeth. And yet, we have documentation or letters between her and several other writers, like Edmund Spenser and George Gascoigne. I mean, several. Everywhere you look for William Shakespeare, there's nothing. No evidence of education. If you look at whoever the great author was, his education was the top. He knew about, French language, Italian language, ancient Greek, Latin. He knew about medicine. There's over 600 references to medicine. He knew about the law and legal terms. He knew about plants and flowers, history, rhetoric, a lot of these topics just were simply not taught at the local grammar school in Stratford-on-Avon, which is what, the Shakespeare experts will tell you is what happened. But it's just not the case. He had to have been somebody who went to university, and yet we have university records of the period. They have survived. There is no William Shakespeare there.
Interesting. You in some of the talking points that I got from you, Katherine, we referenced the Stratford man, and then of course Shakespeare. Is there any documentation? Maybe I'm kind of going off on a tangent on this, but trying to tie Shakespeare to this, is that what is kind of known? The Stratford man and Shakespeare throughout history are kind of tied together, and or the Stratford man is possibly the individual that might be Shakespeare. How does the name tie to the Stratford man?
Yes, and that's a very good question. The first tie between the Stratford man and the great author of, the author of Hamlet and Comedy of Errors, on those wonderful plays, about almost 40 plays, occurred 7 years after the Stratford man had died. And that is in a big book today called The First Folio, which has a very large collection of Shakespeare plays, 36. And in the opening pages of this book, which again, it was after the Stratford man had died, it was printed. For opening pages give tributes to Shakespeare. And on one page is the phrase Stratford Monument by one author in praise of Shakespeare. They make reference to it. And then on another page by another author is a reference to Avon, Sweet Swan of Avon. There is no phrase Stratford upon Avon in those opening pages. There's also no biography on those opening pages. Shakespeare, is known to have a coat of arms, but the coat of arms does not appear in this book. So all the connection between Stratford-on-Avon and the great author occur years after he died. During his lifetime, there was no connection whatsoever. In fact, contemporaries wrote about a different man, actually, when referring to Shakespeare. If you read these allusions to the great author, they're in one chapter of my book, they describe somebody who is known to have written anonymously or with a pen name. They describe him as a man of rank. They describe him as a person writing decades before, the professors believe that he was writing. They say that he was dead by 1607 in one case, and yet, today we're celebrating that he died in 1616.
Right.
So, these are just a few of the anomalies. If you look at what contemporaries were writing, of the great author, mostly while he was alive. So, how does that square with, the Stratford man? It's a huge disconnect, and it's something that really needs to be addressed.
Through your research, Katherine, do you does your book get somewhat controversial? Meaning that people that have followed the works of Shakespeare, maybe not looking at his history or him growing up or his education or anything, but people that just strictly look at his work, when these questions are asked and you do this digging, does that get some people's some people stirred up?
Well, when I explain this to people who I meet, they don't know anything about him, and so when you tell them these facts, most of them are fairly open-minded.
Okay.
People who are not open-minded are the people who teach Shakespeare or the English professors, and they will not address the problems surrounding Shakespeare. They will not address the fact that there's no evidence connecting the Stratford man to the Shakespeare works, and they will call you names.
Really?
And usually name calling is done when when you pretty much have lost the argument. Then you cast aspersions at people,
Right.
and that has been their defense, is just calling us names without addressing the evidence. And it's really sad because many biographies of Shakespeare are filled with speculation. I mean, a good portion is pure speculation, and in some cases they don't even qualify themselves to say that it is speculation. They treat it as if, it's fact.
Well, and it's I'm sure just like the Bible. Okay, of course, there's some people that it's an interesting topic, and I'm cautious when I talk about religion or history in general. But I believe a lot of it, and I would assume you might too, is based on interpretations of the time. Maybe not having all of the facts, people filling in the gaps with their own, their own tale of the, well, I shouldn't say tale of the story, but people fill it in gaps, and then with not necessarily factual information, but then it goes down in history as it is factual. And I could just see people the professors that teach this subject. They take it as gospel, and when someone like you comes along and says, "Hey, look, let's find out the facts. Let's dissect it a little bit," I could just kind of imagine the fallout that can come out of some of this.
Yes, I mean they occasionally will debate us here and there, but in essence they don't treat it as a real question. Yeah. It's we're just persona non grata, and yet many people, including Supreme Court justices, have questioned it, and they believe that there is reasonable doubt of the Stratford man as the great author. And in fact, there's a wonderful website I encourage your listeners to go to, doubtaboutwill.org, and you can see a long list of people who have signed a petition stating that there is reason to doubt, and we need to explore this. And these people come from all different disciplines,
sure,
and many have doctorates. And this is not a lunatic fringe. This is really many very educated people are interested in it and want to have a dialogue.
So, if the Stratford man is not Shakespeare, here's the big question. Then who is William Shakespeare? Do we have definitive proof, or do we have factual or documents or any? You know what I'm saying? If the Stratford man isn't, it's just assumed that for many years it was. Who is William Shakespeare, and is there any trail there?
Well, as I mentioned, contemporary writers, a few of them alluded to Shakespeare as being a person of high rank, and that fits perfectly. People of high rank of that period did not want to be known as writing poetry and plays and drama to be taken seriously, because it was considered a fantastical occupation. As a nobleman or someone of high rank, you should be helping the government as a counselor or as a soldier, a general, an ambassador, what have you. That is the way you serve your country. You do not spend most of your time around actors and writing plays. So he did not want to be known as a writer during his lifetime. In fact, a few of these people who made comments said it would stain him. So it would make perfect sense that a nobleman would be using a pen name. As I mentioned, at least 2 Shakespeare plays were performed before Queen Elizabeth. If you look at early plays presented before the Queen, like in 1577 was a title called The History of Error. This is 1577, and that could very well have been Shakespeare's comedy, A Comedy of Errors, which they believe was written 20 years later. So, in fact, there's several other plays decades earlier than we believe were written that could have been once shown before the Queen. It turns out that Shakespeare was a court playwright, and he just didn't want it to be well known. And the person using the pen name William Shakespeare was the 17th Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere. And, of course, your next guest, Mark Anderson, he's
Yes.
going to give a wonderful talk about the Earl of Oxford. He wrote a whole biography about him.
Interesting.
And he died in 1604.
Wow.
So a little bit off.
Yeah. Well, again, it's so amazing that when and not with Shakespeare, but with so many different historical figures. Again, when you're just taking you take it, people take a lot of things based on faith and again things that were just carried down, especially when we're talking 400 years ago. It's interesting. There's a lot of characters in history. A lot of people in history, if we started dissecting, could probably open up a lot of interesting conversation, Catherine.
Yes, and this controversy has been going on for at least 150 years, and it's not being resolved because the professors are not really taking it seriously. But they will always say, "Oh, this has not been around very long." But if you look as early as 1640. Which was about, over 20 years after the Stratford man had died, somebody printed this phrase about Shakespeare. Shakespeare, we must be silent in thy praise. That's just one line in a longer verse. But why would they say we have to be silent? I mean, he was very celebrated in his lifetime, his works, and this is years after he died. So that is giving you a clue that there is something secret about Shakespeare. And, we've got to start looking at what contemporaries or immediate contemporaries were writing about him instead of, inventing things or looking at very sparse evidence after he had died.
Yeah, it's like they... I don't know if the right word is disgrace him, but they wanted to let sleeping dogs lie almost. Let's not stir the pot.
Yes, and another thing too, the Shakespeare sonnets really show a profile of a nobleman and somebody who was using a pen name. The sonnets were 14-line poems, and Shakespeare wrote 154 of them. And I go into some detail of them in my book. But one very telling one is Sonnet 125. Keep in mind that all the sonnets were written in the first person, so this is really the great author, thinking out loud to himself about himself and about the people that he loved. And he, in Sonnet 125, he says, "Were it aught to me, I bore the canopy, with my extern the outward honoring." And then he goes on and says other things. But to bear the canopy, that was an honor given to people of high rank or distinguished people. And that was to hold a canopy over Queen Elizabeth I when she, was out in public. So you had to have been somebody of rank or distinguished to do that. And he's saying to me, in essence, did it mean anything to me that I held that canopy? Now, anyone who would have the privilege to do that, I mean, that would be a great honor. But here he's saying that he's kind of bored. The concept sort of was trivial to him. So that shows you that he was someone of, higher ranking.
Yes.
He also referred to himself as gracious, which is a term in the Shakespeare plays he always described for princes and high nobility. And another sonnet, he says, Sonnet 81, "From hence your memory death cannot take, although in me each part will be forgotten." And he's talking to somebody else that he knows who's younger, the fair youth. And he says, "Your name from hence immortal life shall have, although I once gone to all the world must die.
Interesting.
So he's saying that the young man he's addressing, that his name is going to live forever, but his name to all the world will die.
Interesting.
So this is another interesting clue that he's dropping
exactly
in poems that he wrote in the first person.
All right, everybody, welcome back to Fringe Radio. Katherine Chiljan is with us tonight. Thank you so much again, Katherine, for taking time out to be here.
Thank you.
We actually got some questions that came in for you. I'm going to go ahead and pose them to you.
Okay.
One of our listeners, who is actually in the UK, writes in and says, Katherine, Ben Jonson, a friendly rival, criticizes and then praises William Shakespeare by name within one of his works called Discoveries. What is your thoughts on that?
Yes, that was written after the Stratford man had died, and it was published after Johnson had died. So it's not really. It was an anecdote. If he wants to read it, I can. I don't have the reference in front of me.
Sure,
but,
sure.
It doesn't. I mean, he was a person. We're not doubting that he was a person.
Okay.
But which person, which Shakespeare was he talking about? Was Johnson speaking about?
Gotcha. Another question was, also Robert Greene, this is another question that came in, it says, also Robert Greene criticized him for daring to compete with him in 1952. Again, another direct reference. What's your thoughts on that?
Yes, I devote a whole chapter to Robert Greene and his book Groat's Worth of Wit. And if you do detailed analysis, it turns out that the upstart crow, which is the person that Greene was referring to, was not the Stratford man or not Shakespeare. It was the well-known actor of the period, Edward Allen. And I'm not the only one who believes this. Several other writers have, historians have believed this. And the main reason to believe it is that Edward Allen was a master. He was a boss of actors and of writers. And he employed Robert Greene. And they had a little problem, evidently. And he was, in a way, he was getting back at Edward Allen for something. I mean, I can't go into detail now, but
Sure.
I think that it's incorrect that the reference is to the Stratford man or Shakespeare.
Interesting, very interesting.
Yeah. But yet that's and it has been questioned who it really was. It's not a foregone conclusion, to quote Shakespeare, that the upstart crow was the great author. It's there has been controversy over the last 100 years or so.
The question I have for you is, again, he's written Macbeth, Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, Julius Caesar, so many different plays. Do you think at the end of the day, people, even the person that so many people for so many years thought was Shakespeare, and now maybe somebody else, do you think that matters to the people that have seen these plays, or the devout Shakespeare? I know there's all the festivals and stuff, but the devoted Shakespeareans, do you think that affects them at all, or do they look by name only? They don't really much care. They just look at the work.
Well, I think there are many people who go to the plays because they love Shakespeare, and they do read biographies because they love Shakespeare, but they're reading about the wrong person.
Right.
And if they had the right person, I think they're going to have a better understanding of the plays and the motivation behind, the characters, like Hamlet, for example. Hamlet, the professors or, experts seem to think that Hamlet was the most autobiographical, and yet look at the description of Hamlet. I mean, he was a prince. He was somebody who owned a theater troupe, or he employed a theater troupe and wrote little things for the troupe. And he you have to look at who he was. He went to university. But that doesn't quite fit the Stratford man. So if you knew that the Earl of Oxford was a great author, and you could immediately see the parallels between Hamlet and the Earl of Oxford. So that's just one instance. Many of the plays, you uncover who the author really is and his life story, and people are going to find him immensely more interesting.
Interesting.
And I mean, if you wrote Romeo and Juliet, wouldn't you want to get credit?
I did.
I mean, it's a simple justice.
I did. I wrote. No,
Yeah.
I'm just kidding with you. No, I agree. I totally agree with you. I really do. Again, because you want, again, it's that tying it all together. And again, people that spend a lot of their life. And I agree with you. When people find something very interesting and they're very passionate about it, and they want to do more and more historical research, and then if at the end of the day, what they thought was truth may now be something different, and different facts come out, and different, more up-to-date research comes out. I could understand how it could change a person's perspective or even their thoughts on things.
Yeah, well, there's many accounts of people who, when they learn that the great author was really the Earl of Oxford, things make sense, and they're happy about it. And there are other people who will get hostile if you bring it up. It's true. It's hard to cut down what really is a myth. It was a myth that started 7 years after the Stratford man had died, and it's just built over the years. But it's like a house of cards. There's no foundation to this belief, and it's time that people start looking at what contemporaries were writing, and not just what the myths were invented after he died, and it's much more interesting too.
Oh, without a doubt. How long did it take you to this book? How long did it take you to write this book?
It took. I've been studying this question for at the time for about 25 years, and then I saw a well-known English professor on a talk show, national talk show, and somebody brought up the authorship question, and he in essence poo-pooed it, put it down. And I thought to myself, what makes him so? I mean, I've been studying this for many years, and what makes him so confident that it is the Stratford man? I mean, I had mostly been looking at the Earl of Oxford's life, but I thought, I'm going to look more deeply at what makes them convinced that the Stratford man was the great author. And so I did, and very soon after, I saw that the evidence really falls into two camps, lifetime evidence and posthumous evidence. And the majority of evidence is posthumous for the Stratford man. And, how reliable is posthumous evidence, after-death evidence? And what did contemporary writers really say about him? And there are several, and we've got to look at that and take it into account instead of ignoring it. And it took me almost 7 years to put this all together. I mean, there are many other wonderful books out there, but this is the book that I wish I had when I first learned about it, when I first saw a debate on television about it between Charlton Ogburn, who wrote this wonderful book, The Mysterious William Shakespeare, against a university English professor, and saw that there was no real debate, because all the English professor could do was just basically say, this is an interesting mystery, but you're crazy. He really couldn't get into anything of substance to show that the Stratford man did write the works.
Interesting.
But Charlton Ogburn really could make point after point, and I thought, gee, I'm going to look into this.
Yeah.
And it's maintained my interest ever since.
Well, it definitely sparked my interest when Mark introduced me to me and having you on the program, and I started doing a little bit of digging. Like I said, outside of some of his famous work, I never really dug into it. And then when I looked at Mark Anderson's work and your work, and a lot of and there's a lot of other stuff going on out there, I found it to be such an interesting topic. Again, I don't want to call it a bait and switch at the end of the day, but again, when you believe it's one person and you have all these supposed facts, and then start dissecting it a little at a time, and you go, it raises a lot of questions.
Yes.
What other stuff are you? What other things are you working on? Are you? Is this the last book in the Shakespeare saga, or are you looking at other things?
Yeah, I'm. My book is pretty much sold, and I am working on printing a new edition, and I'm hoping to get that out this year. And also, I'm trying to write a smaller version as an ebook. So.
Gotcha.
I've been pretty busy, but I also work full-time. I have a day job, so it's a slow process, unfortunately.
Where can our listeners find your book, Katherine?
Right now, it's on Amazon.
Okay.
I also have a website, shakespearesuppressed.com.
Gotcha. And people, can they get the book there as well?
Well, mostly the book is on Amazon. I'm pretty low on copies right now.
Okay.
So, but I will be reprinting this year.
Gotcha.
In the next few months.
Do you do a lot of the Shakespearean events, or get involved with them, I should say?
Not so much. Not so much. I'm pretty much in the libraries more than going to performances. But I watch on TV and stuff.
Well, interesting.
And, of course, I meet with my fellow Oxfordians or anti-Stratfordians at yearly conferences. And
keeps you busy.
Keeps me busy, yeah.
Keeps you really busy. One question that somebody sent in for you, are there any descendants of the Stratford man, or who we believe is Shakespeare, still alive? Is there anything traceable as far as descendants go?
That's a very good question. No, his line ended with his granddaughter, Lady Bernard. And it's interesting. I believe she died in the late 1600s, like 1670 or something like that. And interesting that nobody, went to talk to her, about her supposedly famous grandfather. The same is true for the Stratford man's two surviving daughters. Nobody apparently went and talked to them either, to interview them or mention it. In fact, even his son-in-law, who was a physician, who kept diaries, medical diaries, about his patients and cures and things like that, didn't even mention that he had a well-known writer as his father-in-law. And even the man himself, the Stratford man, he never claimed to be the great author, too. So, I mean, everywhere you look, there's nothing there.
Interesting. Another question that came in from one of our listeners said, how was Shakespeare a very racist individual based on his interchanging of words?
I'm not quite sure what that question is.
Well, I guess of the time, I guess race, the whole subject of racism, that is more of a later thing. But just I know I was looking through some of his his greatest what people took as his greatest insults, and I don't know. It was just a question somebody sent.
Well, I mean, a main character was Othello,
and that's what he was referring to, actually.
Right. I'm not a commentator on the plays themselves and the characters, so I guess I'm not qualified to really say that.
Sure.
I think that he treated him, with respect. I'm not quite sure how to answer the question.
Okay. Well, a different time, for sure.
Yeah.
A different time in history.
I'm more on the historical side, and rather than on the interpretative side.
No problem. I totally understand. Well, Katherine, I want to thank you. The hour went way too quick.
Yeah, sure did.
And I learned a lot. I'm looking forward to. Is Mark one of your colleagues?
Yes.
Okay, well, we're
We've
going
known
to have
each other many years.
we're
so
going to
you'll
have
a-
him up on the other side of the news. But I want to thank you for taking time out of your weekend and your evening to share your work with us. I found it very interesting. Again, didn't know a lot about Shakespeare, but I'm learning a little bit. And now, me, and I'm sure like a lot of our listeners, we're going to dig into it more. And I want to thank you for being here for that.
My pleasure, and we really appreciate you giving us time to get our message out.
Okay, let's stay in touch and do it again. I'm going to do some more reading and digging, and I'm going
I'd
to have
love
you
it.
back. All right, Catherine.
Thank you
Have
so
a great
much.
weekend. Take care now.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Good night.